complexity with scripts that are with source code that is editable in ASCII doc or in Markdown, and therefore contributors can submit things to fit that site and let it be generated for them. I'm assuming you want a static site, so you want your pages to be generated and then served from a static web server, not something that needs dynamic programs to do evaluation of requests. Is that a safe question as well, or are there things?
I don't know, guys. What do you guys think? I'm not sure how to answer that question.
I mean, I feel like that's the right model, generally speaking. I don't know that we need, unless there's some dynamic need that people can imagine. I would definitely default to like having that static artifact intermediary.
Okay, good. So and that was our experience. I think we had started some years ago doing with some pieces of the site being generated dynamically, and the load on the site became unacceptable. And we realized, look, we need to generate static pages so that we get the benefit of content caching. We get the benefit of everybody just getting what looks to them like a read-only page. And we're not computing something at the back end to fill in fields in a page, anything like that. It's all static, generated, but it means we generate very frequently. Every commit, the whole site gets regenerated and published. So in terms of our inspiration, one of the things that inspired us was actually the FreeBSD project's handbook. And so our documentation as a product needed to be expressed, and the inspiration that led Tyler Croy to do it was he looked at the FreeBSD handbook and said, this thing is a work of art. It's beautifully structured. It's got the right sequence of topics. And so he modeled our documentation section, the Jenkins book, on the FreeBSD handbook. And that was, again, taking somebody's good idea and trying to do it. The Jenkins book is, to me, feels weaker than it should be, because we have 15 years of a wiki that should all be in it and isn't yet. But it was a good model for us. So the FreeBSD handbook was a great help. Now the site generation task is where you get to choose the tooling that you would prefer to generate the site. And we used Awestruct. Awestruct lets us do code in Ruby at the back end that helps with the generation of the site. We use HAML files and ASCII doc markup to construct the final static web pages. If I were doing it again, I would probably look at Antora from the same person who writes and cares about ASCII doc. Antora is a site generator. But all those things are, my mind says, for a project the size of Jenkins, with the complexity of Jenkins, they're probably justified. We've got 250,000 installations of servers worldwide, and they're all asking questions back to our servers to check for updates. For a more reasonable sized project, you may just do something as simple as let's use GitHub pages formatted in Jekyll and let that be hosted by the GitHub page. So then the maintenance of the thing is all done in GitHub. You write your content in ASCII doc and let it be presented to the user through a GitHub page. How large is Ortelius compared to, are you a monster project that you've got to deal with the same kinds of problems that Jenkins does, or
No,
a
we
grow?
don't have to. We don't have to. So it is a SaaS product. We're hoping that the CD Foundation accepts us and we can host a SaaS, the SaaS there. So we're not going to have a situation where we have the kind of servers that Jenkins has to manage. So I think the primary need of the website is information, documentation, information on new releases. We would like to be able to define use cases, personas, how the product can be used in the different situations, using different projects. How is it different with Screwdriver than it is with Jenkins? it's really going to be more informational than it would be a, I mean, but if of course now that's going to get built off the SaaS, but the SaaS is going to have a separate website, a separate
Right.
URL.
I mean, so you've got the SaaS-based execution engine
Yeah,
that would construct this site and its static pages and then publish the static pages, basically. So it sounds like you've got a similar model to the Jenkins site where we build it in Jenkins, but it's actually published to a Kubernetes server that serves the pages.
correct.
Okay.
That would be my
All right.
understanding is what the backend would look like.
Okay. So then now in terms of your, yeah, I guess your choices, to me, it seems like if you think you've got to go to something larger, you may want to look at Antora. See, okay, should I use it for site generation? If you'd like to just do a test drive, you could certainly fork the Jenkins.io site and experiment with it to see what would it be like if you wanted to do it in Ostruct.
Okay.
Ostruct is Antora.
And that's what you're using, right?
It
That's
is. That's
okay.
Yeah, so let's see, maybe would it help you if I talked you through the process for the steps that are involved in a change getting to a user? So
Sure.
what does it mean for a user when I want to submit a new change, I want to correct the spelling on a word in a web page on Jenkins.io?
I think that sounds like a great
Okay,
use case.
so let me walk you through it, and I'm going to actually share my screen and show it to you if that's all right.
Sure.
Okay, so, all right, so we start with the Jenkins.io page. Can everybody see my screen okay?
We can.
Super, all right. And so let's pick some piece of documentation like installing Jenkins. And here, let's assume that there might be a mistake in something describing installation of another system. So this page is a static page generated as part, and down at the bottom of the page is the improve this page link that takes me to the GitHub repository where the page actually is. And this is the ASCII doc. So a contributor would say, I want to update something on this page. And maybe the answer is they want to update, take the word optionally out because may is already good enough for optional. So now I just commit the change. I'm going to create a new branch, and we're going to call it, spell Ortelius for me, O-R-T-E-L-L-I-U-S?
Yep, you got it. Oh, no, only one L.
Oh, only one L. Okay,
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So propose the changes. Now, this is no different a workflow than you'll be used to for any GitHub repository, right? This is just getting something started so we can talk about it. So minor phrasing improvement. And this is the GitHub pull request. It's now going to, the useful things are going to start happening now. So I create the pull request. And just like in your environment, that gets detected by some CI server, and it starts to build that pull request as part of its evaluation. And now what's going to happen is this thing will start constructing the site in the pull request. The site construction process takes a Docker image, and using that Docker image runs the Ostruct builder to build the site and run some simple tests on it. Once that pull request is accepted, then it would get merged to the master branch, a master branch builds it and publishes it out to the final destination website, jenkins.io. Now, in terms of parts and pieces, what happened there was Ostruct invoked some Ruby code that converted the ASCII doc to HTML, did some sanity checks, and published it out. And that is visible on this jenkins.io site if we go back to GitHub. So the source code to do all that is here. Yeah, so it uses Ostruct and ASCII doctor. Now I guess time to stop sharing. And did that help at all, or is that, gee, that of course that's the workflow we're all going to use. That's how we'd always do pull requests.
I think that is, I mean, I'm not sure if that's the workflow we'll use, but I think that is the general high-level requirements that we want to achieve.
Okay.
Unless, does anybody else out there have a thought of how that might look for community contribution to the website?
I think that's a great, structure, Mark. But I think we would be a bit early, in going to that path where Jenkins or the structure is. But definitely something we can look forward as we progress.
Yeah.
Well, so as you're envisioning your transition from your WordPress site to a site that's maintained in source code, what sorts of steps are you seeing there? I assume you've got to start up a site someplace in a GitHub repository and test drive it and see how the experience is?
At some point you would have to do that, I would think. There's got to be some kind of a visual test to it, or, whoever's approving the pull request has to be able to look at it.
Well, and that's something actually that we found that, at least I found, is a little daunting, is that it requires that we tell people how to be able to build the site locally.
Yeah,
They need to know
my concern, yeah.
How to construct the site locally, or how to visualize it inside their pull request before they even submit the pull request.
Yeah.
And one of the nice things about the GitHub pages, and likewise Antora, is that you can see the site locally, or in GitHub pages you see them in your own site.
It's kind of like a doxy. It makes it more like a doxy experience.
Yeah, so I'm not aware of Doxy. So Doxy is a documentation as code system as well.
It's based on a Hugo server.
Ah, right. Okay.
So you can see everything. You have you have a preview within Doxy to see what your markdown changes are going to look like. I don't know how interesting it can look. If we did something like that, and I've thought about this, we may have to have like a WordPress front end for now, and then have links to Doxy pages or Doxy chapters, so people could then contribute that way. So we have kind of a combination. I just don't want to go down the road of doing anything and find out that we went too far down the wrong road. If there's other ways of doing that to get there, because we're not as mature as Jenkins, but we don't want to. I want to make sure that the team has the ability to do contributions, and we have the ability to grow the site in a way that makes sense.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Tracy, I was thinking we can do some, could we do some UI mockups, like some simple design or wireframing? Would that help, before we finalize?
Absolutely. Because if we did that, we would have a better understanding of what we needed to support. Because, for example, I don't know, I've never looked at Antora, so I can't say if that would work, but if it's sort of like a Doxy, do you know what is Antora based on a particular server?
I think it's just a static site generator that uses. Okay. Let me do some quick checking here.
So it might read the markdown and then generate the site from that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's it's a site generator.
Yeah,
and
it's exactly what basically what Doxy is.
Yeah, so Antora can be pretty well compared to Hugo, as far as they're basically different underlying bits of tin underneath the surface. Main thing with Antora is it's got a little bit better support for multi-repositories. So if your documentation is fragmented across, say, multiple services where you're keeping the documentation tightly coupled, Antora can support that out the box. You can do that with Hugo. It's the same setup I've done for a couple of companies' internal documentation. It's a little bit more work to get that. I think the big difference, as Antora, as you're saying, is ASCII doc based, whereas Hugo will be Markdown based. As far as the Doxy component of it, that can be pretty much styled however. So that's really just a couple of JavaScript libraries and some CSS and a few other bits and pieces to structure it as a good documentation site. So if there is any kind of wireframes we do internally, that can be pretty much adjusted whichever way we need to on the Doxy and Hugo side.
So Owen, it sounds like if you've got past experience with Hugo, you've got miles away more experience in terms of comparing different doc generators. That's great. So the crucial difference there, Hugo generates static pages as well then. So the question then becomes, how do we structure the site to meet the needs of the users, which is back to a good question. Should we wireframe or discuss what style of site would we like it to look like?
Yeah.
And Jenkins.io is an interesting example. You could look at the Python documentation, right? The Python side, or there are a number of really excellent products out there with the Kubernetes site, with people who have thought very deeply about, how do we present lots of difficult, challenging concepts in a way that is intelligible to users, to readers?
Yeah, so the other site which makes an interesting reference is GitLab. So they did a big piece of work about 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, to move over to a static site generator. And they actually blogged and documented it quite well. So there's a lot of information there about some of the issues they ran into with that migration, which might be relevant for us as well.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Since we're on the topic of, different site generators, would it make sense to probably spin up content and try prototyping on different static site generators? Because I did that for one of my Google Season of Docs projects, and that helped us sort of narrow it down to what we would actually like doing. So I'm not sure if it's like a feasible attempt, but I'm just throwing out the idea there. If we could probably prototype the different sorts of document generators that are out there. So we narrowed down to it down to Docusaurus, but necessarily not necessarily that we want to adopt it here in this project, but I'm just suggesting it as one of the things that we could possibly do.
I think that's an excellent idea. Static. Oh, go ahead, Owen. Excuse me.
No, go ahead, Mark. What I was going to quickly say is one of the things which will be important to take into account with any evaluation is the actual language which the static site generator is written in. Particularly, while we might start with something like a baseline of something like Doxy, we might find there's custom functionality or categorization we want to add in the future. And so having a look at the language and what language is likely to be widely used with the rest of the project can be valuable, I've found, because it helps ensure that people who are contributing to the core project can also help extend the static site generator if they need to. So it's one of the things to take into account that an evaluation could be valuable.
And I have to fully support Owen's observation. One of the things we've found that has helped the Jenkins.io site in its evolution has been that we are able to do custom extensions in little snippets of, in our case, it's Ruby, little snippets of Ruby or of HAML that's Ruby markup as HTML has been a great help for us in being able to make the site useful. We, for instance, now do things like read the latest Jenkins version number from another location, insert it into the generated static site so that the site says the Jenkins version number is something something dot something. And that's one of those things that being able to extend the site generation process was crucial for us. So I agree wholeheartedly with Owen. I've been amazed at the number of times a little bit of extension gave us a whole new concept on the site. Oh, look, here, we're going to do a concept of solution pages that have this layout, and it's still ASCII doc, but it has a different layout because we got to extend the site definition. So extensible site definition for us was quite important. I like that.
I think it may be for us too. We haven't gotten too far down the road of what we call our marketplace, but there's I can see that being able to extend the site will maybe something we should put on our list of requirements.
So now Divya, you had mentioned Docusaurus, and I'm curious, was your experience with that it was extensible? Did it hit the target you needed? And what were your things where you say, oh, I learned this as a painful experience?
The reason why we chose Docusaurus primarily were mostly narrowed down to the fact that the guys at CERN wanted stuff in Markdown, and when we presented to them that this is a particular thing that could be used for writing down the content in Markdown, they immediately jumped at it. So all of their documentation previously was based out of Sphinx, which was really, really, really tough to handle, because the problem with Sphinx is that it has a lot of themes and it has a lot of customizations, but when you are actually converting the source code into the actual API documentation, there is this whole library structure that you have to give in as input, and that kind of has to include the Python libraries that they have in the first place. So building documentation for that was very difficult. So they also wanted JSX support, because a lot of their modules were going to be written in JSX. So that's two things that they were looking out for, and which is why Docusaurus fit the bill for us perfectly. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, if I can say that, because Markdown apart, the extensibility bit works in very well, because a lot of stuff we actually need to keep on adding, and we need to have like a lot of centralization done with respect to the documentation. So there were a lot of documentation in different disparate locations. So they wanted all of that centralized. So that was helpful in getting it in. And we also had the only thing that we are actually looking at is the JSX bit, and that is unfortunately going to come in the stable release for version 2, and it's not there with version 1. So it was kind of a bummer, but again, CERN said that it was going to be there, the JSX release was going to be there next year. So I think that perfectly coincides with their timings.
So you had mentioned Markdown. I remember arriving to contribute to Jenkins documentation and being, oh, why isn't this in Markdown? And I read, and I think I understand their intent in choosing ASCII doc instead of Markdown, because of the far fewer variants there are in ASCII doc compared to the number of variants there are of Markdown. So your choice of which markup language is an important choice for your community. In our case, we chose ASCII doc. If you choose Markdown, that I think will then drive which site generator you choose. Now, Owen, I assume you've had experience with both. Any comments you want to share there in terms of your experience in different markup languages?
Yeah, sure. So what you said was absolutely correct. ASCII doc's main advantages are it's pretty much universal where there is support. There's not the same variances between like Daring Markdown and GitLab Zone Markdown and all of that side of things. The main drawback, I would say, with ASCII.doc is it's not as common in use as Markdown is. If you have Markdown, everyone can start contributing, and you can limit the impact of the variance of Markdown by having a good pipeline in place, something which can give fast feedback to say, this isn't valid in our version, and from also just having clear examples of what the Markdown would look like. If we're using GitHub Pages in the end, that one's a fairly well understood syntax of Markdown. Hugo, if I remember correctly, supports the same basic extensions as the GitHub Pages does. So there's ways we can standardize it, but you do sometimes run into issues where, because someone's written something in a flavor of Markdown they're familiar with, when it gets rendered, it doesn't quite look the way they're expecting. So being able to spin up a draft site as well is quite useful, and having that as part of the review process. So similar to what we have with the CDF landscape and the CF landscape and all of those ones, where you can get a draft one which is rendered as part of a pipeline, which someone can then go in and visually check that actually this does look correct. So there's ways to offset it. But yeah, fully agree. And one of the things I wanted to quickly say on the from the Docusaurus, I think that's a really good example of the language side of it, because remember correctly, Docusaurus is React based. So the plugins are written in React, which are the extensions. So that will, once the functionality is available around the JSX files, that will line up quite nicely. And it is those kind of two axes when you're looking at static site generators. The first one being, what is the markup syntax? Markdown, ASCII.doc, the other options are available as well. And then the second category you're looking at is, what is the language which a static site generator is written in? And if you can align those, you can be in a pretty good place, but you need to evaluate both. Probably the markup syntax first, as there's almost always some kind of tool which will work with that markup syntax in a language which you're familiar with.
Right. Yeah, I like that summary. That's great, because for us it was, I think ASCII.doc was chosen at least in part out of a sense of purism. Ooh, I like that it's got rigorous definition, etc. But that was years ago that choice was made, and Markdown continues to become a stronger and stronger player amongst programmers, right? It's obvious native support in GitHub, GitLab. So there's an element where you say, oh, should we choose Markdown as our markup language, and then a tool set that will let us do static site generation with Markdown. And
we already have a documentation site which has a significant amount of Doxy style Markdown, and so continuing to build that out, I think, is probably a good idea. And to get back to Owen's comments on the language thing, I've got a friend that spent a lot of time studying these things, and we go back and forth with them occasionally. And I was just looking at a site that was having a list of these sort of things, and it's like, 80% of the stuff that's out there is JavaScript based in this realm, and sort of Hugo and a couple of other things sort of stand alone as being non-JavaScript sort of stuff. And in terms of Ortelius, this isn't an area that I really expected to be making any major contributions to. And so my distaste for like writing more JavaScript, I didn't want to inject that into the process. But, if anybody else feels similarly, that certainly helps eliminate a lot of things. And sadly, Docusaurus looks like that would be one of the things that's eliminated if we made that sort of decision. And I don't know that my concern as an ops person from this sort of thing is, I would guess that any of these things is going to take, a little bit of time to do this sort of thing, and we want that to be as tight a cycle as possible. And and if these JavaScript solutions in a Docker container can do this zippier than I would guess they could, then that's great. But I feel like Hugo I've got more faith that it's going to stand up to the performance and scalability that we might, hope to get to someday.
Yeah, so my JavaScript experience is limited to none. And so, but again, I was coming into an environment where the tool set was already defined, right? The Jenkins project, as I began contributing documentation, had already selected Awestruct and AsciiDoc. And so for me, it was a simple choice. It had the benefit that it didn't put me into any, I need to write JavaScript to do extensions. It did for me have the challenge, back to Owen's point, that it put me into the place where I have to write Ruby, and I'm a Python programmer. So that was a little uncomfortable, but I think I've actually started to learn and adapt. So I think Owen's points on markup language and implementation language of the generator are both valid things for you to consider. Now, in terms of structuring the site, Tracy, how do you envision that evolving? Is that something you see, initially was described, should use wireframes, or is there some high level view of these are the kinds of things we want to include already that might drive you towards one solution or another?
I don't think we know that answer to that at this point.
Okay. I know that for us, we wanted to be able to include tutorials, and we wanted to be able to embed videos, and we wanted to be able to do things that would help users. We also wanted a classic page by page flow through certain segments where you feel like, I know what the next page is I'm supposed to read if I'm reading as though it were a book.
Exactly. Those kinds of things, yeah.
And those kinds of facilities are there. I assume that the site, most of the site generators already have that kind of a concept. Awestruct does it for us, and I could show you how it does it, but I suspect you'll choose, you just want to be sure you evaluate that in whichever site generator you choose, does it allow me to construct these different navigation flows through the site comfortably and just using the Markdown language that I'm using, or using Markdown plus some extension?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, I think we're going to end up using Markdown plus some kind of extension. I don't think Markdown alone is going to solve the problem.
Okay, yeah.
I just don't think it has enough of the features that we're going to need. Now, that being said, we might keep the documentation, the pure documentation in Markdown for now. I don't think we want to do that anytime soon. To convert that, there's a lot of documentation already written. At least several hundred pages.
And now in terms of, I've not looked at how the Markdown systems do site styling, but I assume, Owen, that Hugo and other Markdown systems allow you to do site styling very comfortably, so they can fit your style, and the look and feel that you want for the pages will just be applied to all pages automatically.
Yeah, so within the Hugo space, which is one I'm more familiar with, you have the concept of your content, which is your Markdown files. That comes with some header information you put in each file, which can specify date it was written on, categorization if you're going to be using categories. You then have themes, which are basically just CSS and some JavaScript, and a few other bits which are bundled together, and that actually handles what the site looks like. As with most of static site generators, what you can do is use the header information, the front matter in each page, to say, actually, this one is excluded from this theme, or this one classes as a separate type of categorization. So quite often you might have equivalent of a label which says, these are part of my doc site, but this page is going to be an about page. So this doesn't get rendered in that, and so that appears on the menu depending on the theme. So there's a lot of flexibility there. You can pretty much create whatever you want to in that regards. And when it gets rendered, the Markdown gets converted into HTML. As for all static site generators, the themes are applied, and the various categories you put through will get converted into various classes within the CSS, which kind of all ties it together towards the end. So it's a nice separation in some ways, because your content and how it renders can be largely separate concepts outside of that header information you put in a given page. So it allows that kind of divorce of concerns. And it also allows you to restyle it quite easily if you're finding certain bits aren't working, while keeping the content pretty much universal. It's not quite that easy in practice, but that's the general gist of how it should work if it all goes well. There's always the odd bit where a bit of front matter needs to be updated, but because that's a structured format, you can script that pretty well. So you can quite easily quickly loop over it and make additions through a makefile, for example.
And what Owen said echoes exactly what the Jenkins.io pages use. We have a front matter section that precedes, that's at the top of each ADOC file, that's used to define what the page layout is, or in this case, the theme or the style of that thing. So we know when it's a solution page or a tutorial page or a page from a book. And that front matter is a great help to allow that subsection of the site to be rendered consistent with the same pages in that subsection. Yeah, I admit I like that a lot. It's just exactly the benefits that Owen highlighted. By having consistent layout defined in a single place and applied to many pages, it works quite nicely. Yeah.
Well, Mark, we've taken the 30 minutes that we asked for, so I'm not going to bug you anymore. I know you have a busy day. I've recorded this, so what I think we need to do is everybody kind of think about what we discussed today, and I think next Tuesday is our general community meeting. Let's review it, and if we want to pull a working group together to, as Parajat suggested, do some markdown of, or not markdown, but some sketching or definition of what we want the site to look like and what are those particular requirements, we can do that. But this has been very helpful.
Thanks for your patience. Well, sorry I spilled over by 10 minutes. I try to be rigorous on time. I should have stopped my blabbing. And
no, we appreciate it. I just don't want to take a full hour because I think you had a pretty full day today, according to your calendar.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for the time.
Everybody, thank you
Great to
for
meet you,
coming.
Mark.
We'll chat on
Pleasure.
Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.